On November 26, 1941, a powerful Japanese fleet quietly set sail from Japan. The fleet was impressive, including 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, and hundreds of aircraft. Their mission was top secret. They were to reach a hidden point 230 miles north of Oahu, Hawaii. Their ultimate target was the United States Pacific Fleet anchored at Pearl Harbor. This attack was carefully planned for December 7th, and the Japanese military expected it to completely surprise the Americans. The goal was to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet, keeping it out of action for months and allowing Japan to expand freely across Southeast Asia. However, while the attack did have a devastating effect on the American fleet, it also sparked a massive reaction from the United States. This surprise move drew the U.S. fully into World War II and led to Japan's eventual defeat. But why would Japan risk such a bold attack? To understand the reasons, we need to look back at the 1930s and the forces that drove Japan's aggressive expansion. In the 1930s, Japan had set its sights on building a vast empire in Asia. Like the European powers, Japan wanted to control more territory and increase its global influence. However, Japan faced a serious obstacle. It lacked the natural resources needed to sustain such an empire. Japan's islands had limited coal iron, and most crucially oil. Without these, Japan couldn't fuel its navy or keep its industries running, and its ambition for an empire would be nothing more than a dream. So Japan began looking beyond its borders for these essential resources. In 1931, Japan took its first big step by invading Manchuria, a region in northern China rich in resources like coal and iron. By controlling Manchuria, Japan gained some of the raw materials it needed and established a strategic position on the Asian mainland for future expansions. This was just the beginning. Over the next several years, Japan pushed further into China, taking more land and challenging Chinese forces. By July 1937, these tensions erupted into a full-scale war. Initially, the Japanese army achieved a series of swift victories, capturing city after city. However, as Japan advanced, its forces committed horrific acts, including the infamous Nanking Massacre, where Japanese soldiers killed and assaulted thousands of Chinese civilians. These brutal actions shocked the world, drawing international outrage and condemning Japan's aggressive actions. But despite these initial gains, by 1939, the war in China had reached a stalemate. Japan was struggling to maintain its supply lines, and the costs of the war were draining its economy and manpower. Japan faced a new problem. If it wanted to continue the war and build its empire, it needed more resources than ever before. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the United States was observing Japan's expansion with increasing concern. In the early 1930s, the U.S. had largely focused on domestic issues, especially the Great Depression, which had left millions of Americans jobless. However, the rise of aggressive powers like Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan began to shift American public opinion. President Franklin Roosevelt, recognizing the threat posed by these nations, started preparing the U.S. to support its allies. In 1939, the U.S. passed a Neutrality Act allowing it to supply weapons to Britain and France on a cash-and-carry basis, meaning they had to pay up front and transport the goods themselves. By 1941, Roosevelt expanded this support with the Lend-Lease Act, which allowed the U.S. to send military aid to any country fighting the Axis powers, including China and the Soviet Union, without demanding immediate payment. Although technically neutral, the U.S. was clearly moving closer to supporting the Allies, a stance that worried Japan, which saw America as a barrier to its own ambitions in Asia. As Japan's need for resources grew, its leaders debated two strategies for expansion: the Northern Strategy and the Southern Strategy. The Northern Strategy, supported by the Japanese army, focused on attacking the coal iron and oil-rich regions of Siberia and Mongolia, which were controlled by the Soviet Union. The Southern Strategy, supported by the Imperial Navy, involved striking south to seize resource-rich British and Dutch colonies in Southeast Asia like Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, which were abundant in oil and rubber. In the late 1930s, Japan tested the Northern Strategy, engaging in border skirmishes with Soviet forces. However, in 1939, the Japanese suffered a major defeat at the Battle of Kokon-Gol, where Soviet Mongolian forces decisively pushed them back. With the army bogged down in China and the Northern Strategy in ruins, Japan turned south, focusing on capturing the valuable resources of Southeast Asia. Japan's southern push began in earnest in 1940 when it entered northern French Indochina with the approval of the Vichy French government. Japan wanted to cut off a key Chinese supply route through this area, hoping to weaken Chinese resistance. But the United States saw Japan's move into Indochina as an act of aggression and a threat to its interests in the Pacific. In response, the U.S. imposed an embargo on exports of iron, steel, and copper to Japan. These materials were essential for Japan's war industries, and their loss was a serious blow. However, Japan did not back down. In July 1941, they occupied even more of French Indochina, intending to use it as a base for further expansion southward. This time, the U.S. took even stronger action, imposing a complete embargo on oil exports to Japan. With most of its oil coming from the U.S., Japan now faced an energy crisis that threatened its entire military operation. Japan was now in a desperate situation. Without American oil, its Navy and Air Force would soon be grounded. Japan attempted to negotiate with the U.S., but America's demands were firm. Japan had to withdraw from China and end its alliance with Nazi Germany and Italy. For Japan, these terms were humiliating. Accepting them would mean abandoning its imperial ambitions and admitting defeat. The Japanese government decided it had no choice but to secure the resources it needed by force. However, Japan knew that any invasion in Southeast Asia would likely provoke an American military response. Therefore, Japanese leaders concluded that the only way to gain a temporary advantage was to strike the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, crippling it before the Americans could interfere. On the morning of December 7, 1941, at 7:55 a.m., the first wave of 183 Japanese planes appeared over Pearl Harbor. The American forces were completely unprepared. The Japanese planes were divided into three groups. The first two, consisting of dive bombers and fighters, targeted the airfields where American planes were lined up wingtip to prevent sabotage. Ironically, this arrangement made them easy targets. The third group, consisting of torpedo bombers, attacked the American ships in the harbor, focusing especially on the battleships along Battleship Row. The Americans had thought that the water in Pearl Harbor was too shallow for torpedo attacks, but the Japanese had developed a new torpedo that worked perfectly in the shallow harbor with devastating results. Within minutes, several battleships were hit, including the USS Oklahoma, which capsized, and the USS Arizona, which exploded, killing over 1,100 crew members. At 8:54 a.m., a second wave of 170 Japanese planes arrived, aiming at similar targets. By this time, the base was on high alert and American anti-aircraft fire was stronger. Even so, the damage was severe. In just over an hour, the Japanese had sunk or damaged 18 American ships, destroyed 188 aircraft, and inflicted heavy damage on the base's infrastructure. However, a key element of the American fleet, the aircraft carriers, was away on maneuvers, sparing them from destruction. The Japanese hadn't anticipated this, and missing the American carriers would prove a costly oversight in the months to come. The Pearl Harbor attack was initially a stunning success for Japan. On the same day, they launched coordinated attacks across the Pacific, quickly taking control of Guam, Wake Island, the Philippines, British Malaya, and Hong Kong. They even managed to sink two major British warships off the coast of Malaya. By early 1942, Japan had expanded its empire across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, gaining the resources it had long needed. But Japan's bold gamble ultimately failed. The attack on Pearl Harbor, while devastating in the short term, galvanized the American public and government. America's industrial might was unmatched, and once the U.S. mobilized for war, Japan was outmatched. In a sense, Japan had awoken a sleeping giant by attacking Pearl Harbor. While Japan hoped the U.S. would be reluctant to engage in a prolonged war, it soon became clear that the attack had only strengthened America's resolve to fight. In the end, Japan's decision to strike Pearl Harbor may have given it temporary access to resources, but came at a massive long-term cost. The attack drew the United States into World War II with full force, and Japan could not match America's industrial or military power. Japan's imperial ambitions had led it to underestimate the United States, and the consequences were devastating both for Japan and for the world.